seminar is about how sea level is affecting the forest in the east coast of the United States. She is here as part of a Fulbright scholarship, and she is working with that lady who is going to make the introduction to who you are while you're here. And after that, we can start with the seminar. As you said, we have the chance from here to here. And usually we take 45, 50 minutes for the seminar, and then we around 10, 15 minutes for questions and discussions. See that? And we'll be sitting around here, so it's just looking here. It's okay. So.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos por venir. Es un placer presentarles a Keryn y Gedan, que hicimos la cuenta y hace casi 8 años que estuvo acá dando un seminario en Phragmites, también pero en el edificio viejo. Keryn es ecóloga y diría que es una naturalista entusiasta. Cada vez que vamos a pasear por algún lado está ahí preguntando por las plantas y observando cada detalle. Así que y hoy nos va a estar contando sobre su trabajo en la costa este de Estados Unidos. Keryn es profesora de la Universidad de George Washington University y yo la conozco hace muchos años cuando compartimos oficina en la Universidad de Brown, cuando éramos las dos estudiantes de doctorado. Keryn habla perfecto castellano y entiende perfecto castellano, así que por eso estoy hablando en este idioma. Y los invito a cuando termine la presentación, preguntarme lo que quieran sin el problema de la barrera del idioma. Así que, bueno, Keryn, te doy la palabra. ¿Ves para acá la luz?
No, las otras.
¿Por dos? Así se puede ver mejor la presentación. Sí.
Muchas gracias a Lucía, a todos por venir. I'll switch to English, but I hope that you feel comfortable speaking Spanish with me, and I love to practice my Spanish. I'm still learning, and you should feel comfortable speaking either language. So it's a great pleasure to be here after 8 years, and last seminar I told you something about the ghost forests, which are these forests that are dying due to sea level rise. I've done a lot of work on them since then, and I have much more to add to the story. So I run the Gedan lab at George Washington University, work on coastal ecology broadly and global change. And I'm a member of some long-term and national scale networks that do research. So that always kind of informs my science. One of them is called they're both funded by the National Science Foundation. One of them is called the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. And I work at a site called the Virginia Coast Reserve, which is on the East Coast, sort of the middle of the East Coast of the US. And another one is called the Coastal Critical Zone, which is to explore connections between plants, water, soil, and atmosphere. And so they're both interdisciplinary efforts and kind of long-term, large-scale observational efforts. I think you'll see data from both of these in my talk. I mention these so that you know kind of my perspective and what I do, who I am, but also because I'm recruiting a graduate student currently and a technician for next year, and if there were any students that you have that might be interested in a PhD in the US, please talk to me about them after the talk. So my background is in coastal wetlands. This is my happy place, both in mangroves and in salt marshes. And my dissertation work was looking at how climate change and temperature change especially affects these ecosystems. Some of my postdoc work was in mangroves, looking at water quality and acidification. But one thing that I really love about salt marshes and tidal wetlands in general is that they're very relevant to people. They provide all these ecosystem services, and so a study that was a landmark study back in the 90s was trying to quantify all the ecosystem services from the habitats around the world, and they found that tidal wetlands provided the most value per square unit of area of a habitat. And so I just list out these ecosystem services here, some of them probably important to you all too. The storm barrier of tidal wetlands that helps protect the shoreline and reduce waves and prevent erosion. nutrient and gas regulation, so they're really important carbon sinks, globally important carbon sinks. Nursery habitat for fishery species, like crabs and shrimp and fish as well. And they're important wildlife habitat for some rare and endangered species, as well as species, iconic species. So I've been studying for the last few years these effects of sea level rise, and this is a really interesting ecosystem to study sea level rise because of the feedbacks and interactions between the species and the water column. So the hydro period is really important in tidal wetlands, as you can imagine, but there's important ecosystem engineering that the plants do that create the whole ecosystem, so that we call these a foundation species. Basically, the grasses of the salt marsh slow the water and catch sediment such that much more sediment falls out of the water column, the suspended sediment falls out of the water column and builds this platform of marsh soil called marsh peat. And that gets filled with roots, the plants grow even higher, they catch more, the sediment grows more, and we call that vertical accretion. It's a very organic sediment, and it provides this feedback that when the plants are submerged more, they're able to catch more sediment, and there's more vertical accretion. So it's a positive feedback loop. And that makes it's a resilience mechanism that makes marshes able to keep up with sea level rise through time. It's why we haven't seen this habitat drowned at this point. Another important thing is that these are terrestrially derived grasses. And so they're living underwater intertidally for part of the day. And that's a stressful situation for terrestrial grasses. So the salinity is very high, the sediment is very anoxic, and those are stresses that these grasses are generally very highly adapted to deal with. So it's kind of an interesting evolutionary relationship. The area that I have focused on geographically in the mid-Atlantic here, this is the Virginia Coast Reserve where I work in the center of the US East Coast. And it's a hot spot for sea level rise. So this is another reason that it's been a great topic to study where I work, because the rates of sea level rise are 2 to 3 times the global average. And that's partially due to subsidence of the land and partially due to some regional factors like currents that go offshore, just the ocean dynamics. But as a result, we've seen high rates of relative sea level rise, high rates of coastal change. And so I think of this as a window to the future for the world. And this is just a picture that I bought the copyright to off a photographer of the tidal basin in Washington, D.C. So my university is located in downtown Washington, D.C., just a short walk from this location where you can see some of the kind of most iconic monuments of the capital city of the U.S. And this bench is clearly normally on a sidewalk that's underwater. And this is called sunny day flooding. So this is a flood that came on land not as a result of a storm, just a normal high tide, a rather extreme but normal high tide that came on land and flooded areas that hadn't been flooded in a long time. So for my talk, I'll present a few different pieces of research. First, I'll give you a little more background on sea level rise, forest retreat, and coastal wetlands. Then I'm going to talk about the scale and distribution of land cover change in response to sea level rise. I'll talk about how future marsh communities will look based on what we've been studying happening today. And then lastly, a more kind of physiological perspective of how salinity might kill trees. So beginning with kind of this background. So first of all, it's useful to think about these coastal environments in cross sections. So what is the elevation change? Because the elevation change determines most importantly the hydro period, how long they're underwater due to tidal changes. And so here on this graphic you can see the the tidal range in this system. So this would be mean high water, mean low water, and mean sea level here. And the tidal wetlands exist in this very small elevation range between mean sea level and mean high tide. So it's very flat. It can be quite extensive, but it's very narrow in the vertical dimension. And then you can have these annual storms that reach much higher than the mean high tide. And this will inundate areas of the coast where you see transitional habitats. And then you can think about sea level rise shifting all of these tidal levels upward. And so the annual storm will inundate farther inland. But because the habitat is so finely tuned to this hydro period, we expect to see really big changes in the distribution of coastal marshes in response to sea level rise. And so there are some models that are very widely used to predict how this distribution will change. And this is one that was just updated in 2021. So this is really nice new data about one of my study sites. So here on the east coast of the US, I have a little inset. You can see this is an estuary, the Chesapeake Bay, which is the largest estuary in the United States. And it's also the estuary that reaches up to Washington, D.C. But this is the other side of the estuary. This is a huge protected area, federally protected area that is predominantly marsh habitat, and it's protected for bird migrations. There's just hundreds of thousands of migratory birds come through these wetlands each year. And the colors here, the orange color shows you the high marsh area, light blue is low marsh, the green is the forest, blue open water, and red is other types of upland other than forest. So now I'll just show you, this is 2010 distribution of land cover, and I'll advance to show you the predicted changes through time. So this is the low or best case sea level rise prediction for 2100 of 0.59 meters. And you can see all the high marsh converts to low marsh. This is sort of a best case scenario. Right now we're not following this trajectory in terms of carbon emissions and climate change. So it's not very realistic. And the worst case scenario, well, maybe not the worst case, but one of the worst cases, the business as usual, if we do nothing, kind of change nothing scenario. This is what the area is predicted to look like with 1.23 meters of sea level rise, and the whole area converts to open water. There's basically no tidal wetlands left in the system. So this is a really scary thing for a tidal marsh ecologist and someone who cares a lot about this field site and all the biodiversity that's protected there. So yeah, I don't want to see this happen. And the major concern here is marsh habitat loss. If this happens around the world at a lot of different sites, we're going to lose a lot of tidal marsh habitat. But one thing, most of these models do a really good job with that process I was telling you about, the vertical accretion. And that's because we have a lot of really cool data sets on this process. We've been measuring vertical accretion for a lot of years, decades, usually in a lot of marsh sites. So I do this at the Virginia Coast Reserve using this tool called a surface elevation table, SET. And it's essentially like a big metal rod that's sunk into the ground until it's geologically stable. And then every year we attach this arm and drop these pins down to very carefully measure the surface of the sediment within a millimeter of accuracy. And we do that at a number of locations, year after year after year. And so this is the record for the VCR Virginia Coast Reserve, showing the surface elevation of the low marsh, mid marsh, and high marsh through time. And so we can estimate a rate of vertical accretion that's 4.9 millimeters per year that the marsh is growing, and that actually is slightly higher than the rate of relative sea level rise at this site. So we know that the marshes are actually keeping up with sea level rise at this site. One thing to note, first of all, the sea level, if you looked at a graph of mean sea level through time, it would be bumping all over the place because there's a lot of cycles, tidal cycles, that influence that rate of sea level, that level of sea level. So it's kind of interesting to see that the marsh is sort of time averaging much more smoothly than the actual sea level. Another thing is the rate in the low marsh is slightly higher than what we see in the high marsh. And so we do expect over time for high marsh to convert to low marsh as the high marsh kind of in the tidal frame becomes lower and lower. But this is only in the vertical dimension. So what I've been encouraging everyone in our field to do is think in the horizontal dimension as well, because we're seeing really big changes there, and that's kind of my research focus. So we're seeing the forest edge retreat and the marsh advance in towards the uplands, upslope. So this was a study looking at historical photographs in the Delaware Bay, just north of the Chesapeake Bay, and they were mapping where that forest marsh boundary was through time and saw that from 1930 till 2003, it moved 100 and some meters at a rate of approximately 2 meters per year. So this is a real change in our coastal ecosystems that's happening on geological timescales. You know, you can see over the course of a year that much movement in that coastal forest boundary. I'll just also mention, in this study, they found a large part of this marsh advance became this one species of grass, Phragmites australis, that's an invasive species that I'll talk about again later. So we can conceptualize this change as the ecotone migrating in the horizontal dimension across the landscape, and it has a leading edge and a trailing edge, and this area in between called the ecotone that's a transitional community. And in the wake of that change, we see this new habitat emerging called ghost forests. So this is a picture of a ghost forest at one of my field sites in Chesapeake Bay, and this is thousands of dead trees that have lost all their leaves and branches, and what tends to happen is the leaves and branches drop off while the trunks remain for a long time. And the marsh grasses move into the understory. And again, this is another site and what that looks like. So we've seen the occurrence of ghost forests around the US and around Canada. So North America, we've seen them pretty much on the East Coast and the Gulf coasts. But I haven't really heard about them from other parts of the world, and that's part of what brought me to South America, is to see if this same change is happening in forests in other continents. It seems like it should be wherever there's a shallow coastal plain that's forested and rates of sea level rise are having an influence. But we documented the geographic distribution of these, and this idea of ghost forest kind of got a lot of media attention because it's a very visible sign of sea level rise, which is a process that's so incremental it can be really hard for the public to visualize. And so the New York Times covered this, and there's been kind of through the years constant media interest. And it tends to be right around Halloween, because Halloween is when everyone in the US loves a ghost story. And so a lot of the media outlets say, oh, ghost forest, that's a great story for Halloween. So I've actually learned, oh, if I want to push out a paper and get the press to cover it, I need to just drop it in October. So one of the first things I wanted to do in this system is document the scale and pace of land use changes due to sea level rise. And I started on this in a county in the Chesapeake Bay, a coastal county that has very high rates of sea level rise, like the rest of the area, but also is very, very shallow sloping. So it's low elevation and shallow sloping, and we expected to see a lot of land cover change there. So working with a few other people, my postdoc Manshi and an economist at University of Maryland, Becky Aponcha-Neal, we we used some very high resolution spatial data, 1 meter pixel size, to document change in land cover on the time scale of 2009 to 2017, which were the two extremes when we had this high resolution digital imagery. And we were able to detect a lot of change here depicted in yellow, and you can also see the topography of the area that ranges from 0 to about 10 meters in elevation above sea level. So it's very, very low lying. And then we looked at where those land cover transitions occurred and some of the landscape features about the land cover transitions. And so in yellow, we have all of the pixels that transitioned, whereas in gray are the rest of the pixels. And we were able to tell that areas that transitioned were lower in elevation and closer to tidal water than areas that didn't, indicating that sea level rise is driving these transitions. Whereas if it wasn't related to sea level, you'd expect them to be more mixed. And this looks like a scary and confusing plot if you've never seen an alluvial plot before, but let me take a moment to explain it so you can understand. This is all of the area of land that experienced a land cover transition during these 8 years. So this is what the transitional land started as in 2009. You can see the biggest land class of land cover transitions was in agriculture, and the second biggest was in forest. And then what they transitioned to in 2017. So you can see what these land uses became. So you can see that agriculture, the largest group of pixels, transitioned to become emergent wetland. And the same with the forest. About half of the forest land that transitioned became emergent wetland, and the other half became shrub wetland, which is probably this transitional ecosystem that becomes wetland after. It's kind of what we find in the ecotone area. So we can see then that a lot of the land cover transition, again, supporting that this is all due to marsh migration, all of the land cover change in this county. And interestingly, we were able to look at the land cover, the probability of land cover transition of all of these different land use types. And we found that agricultural land was more likely to transition to emergent wetland than forest land. So it seems like the agricultural land was especially vulnerable to change. And I have some ideas about why that is, mostly related to the salinity tolerance of the crops that we grow in the region, which is very low. So we tend to grow corn and soy, both of which have fairly low salinity tolerance. And especially the corn seems to get hit pretty hard. This is a picture I took of a field. So overall, the results of this study then were that 1% of the county's farmland, or 3.5 square kilometers, and 0.5% or 1.4 square kilometers of forested land transitioned to emergent wetland during these 8 years. So those percentages are not very large, but this was only 8 years of data. Most land cover change studies go back 50, 60, 70 years and use all this historic imagery. But here, this is only a very recent change. And we also found that this agricultural land was more likely to transition. So this was a big heads up to us that farmland is being affected by sea level rise as well as forested land. And I have a bunch of projects now in farmland that I'm not really going to talk about today, but I'd be happy to speak with you about them afterwards. But I did include a few photos so you can see what it looks like when farmland is salinized by sea level rise. So these are some, a collaborator with a drone has collected some really great imagery of some sites we've been working at. So you can see these bare areas are a result of the form of agriculture that we use, that is used around the world, where the field is completely cleared prior to planting the crop. So there's really nothing else growing there. Most of our crops are called Roundup ready. They're herbicide tolerant, and herbicides are broad scale sprayed. And so the only thing that survives is the crop. And then when the salinity rises, the crop can't tolerate the salinity, and we get these bare areas of soil. So something I've been working on with a geographer now is to actually map these bare areas of soil because they produce a really great signal in remotely sensed imagery, so you can detect them very quickly and easily. In another picture, this is a soy field, also affected around the edges. You can see that the edges of the fields are particularly affected, and that's because there are ditches running around the field, or small canals that are tidally influenced. And just a close-up of the cornfields you can see. So this this result in farmland and the projects that we've set up on farmland have given us a really neat way to engage the community around this issue of sea level rise. And we hold stakeholder meetings every year to talk to farmers, present to them our research, and hear from them what their thoughts are about what's changing in their communities. And that's been really interesting. We've set up some coastal farming challenges workshops to talk to even more farmers online and hear their experiences and answer their questions. So I've found that, you know, the agricultural impacts of sea level rise has provided a really interesting platform for engaging communities. And it's also been a way that I've been able to interact with policymakers. So I was an author on the Maryland, the state's plan to adapt to saltwater intrusion. And I also worked with the USDA, reviewing for them their Southeast manual about salinization of cropland there. So it's been great. We kind of made this discovery of how the farmland's being influenced, and there's just been huge amounts of interest. We actually can't keep up the research with the demands of the stakeholders and community. So another thing that I did to engage the public is launch this citizen science effort called Ghosts of the Coast, which is just a place where the public can go and learn about ghost forests, what they are, what they look like, and they can also contribute observations. And so we've spoken to school groups and things like this, and we have this mobile phone survey that you can take a QR picture of the screen right now if you wanted to. Use this QR code to go to our survey, and if you see a ghost forest, you can upload your own photo of the ghost forest there. Part of the reason we're doing this is to be able to figure out where these things are around the world. So like I said, I've been really hoping to find some South American ghost forests. Right now we've had observations contributed from across the East Coast, and there's been 45 observations to date. So this is great because we work really heavily. I think I probably know all of these sites, but it's hard to really know where this is occurring and where this is happening. So the survey asks people to contribute a photo and some information about the site, including what species they see there. And then we've been doing research on the ground to see what's happening in real time. And the question that I really want to answer, because I care about tidal wetlands so much and they're moving inland, is will future marsh plant communities resemble present-day marsh communities? Will they still provide the same habitat benefits and ecosystem services as they do today? So for this, we're setting up a new long-term experiment in a forest that's very affected by sea level rise in the Virginia Coast Reserve. And we essentially have this kind of very shallow sloping elevation gradient where freshwater resources are greater in the forest and they become saltier as we go down, and you see the ghost forest emerging at this end. And at the same time, because the canopy is opening, then at the ground level, there's big changes in light availability. So I think about this ecosystem as two different resource gradients that are in opposing directions. And what we're going to do in this system is we have 24 plots, large forest plots set up, and we've been studying these plots for 4 years. And in the next year, we're going to girdle half the plots, all the trees in half the plots, essentially creating a forest disturbance experiment that mimics ghost forest formation in real time, and we'll be able to watch the community transition. We have this at 3 different levels, this sort of healthy forest level here, this stressed forest level here and the ghost forest or dying forest right here. And so we'll be able to tell the role of the sort of legacy effects on the changes that occur in response to tree death. So the site, again, is in the sort of the coastal area near the Chesapeake Bay. It's in these coastal lagoons, and the mainland's right here. And the site looks like this. We kind of divide it into high forest, where the forest is relatively healthy, mid forest, where it's stressed, and low forest, where it will be a ghost forest soon. And the differences between these elevations are mere centimeters. So usually 5 centimeters between the levels. There's more variation within a plot, really, than between the levels. So it's very, very flat. And this is kind of a space for time design, because we expect that these low forest plots resembled the high forest at some time in the past. And so before the disturbance, we can still learn a lot about the site just using this space for time inference. One surprise at the site has been how many times it's been flooded. And so when we started working here, we thought, oh, maybe we'll get lucky and get a storm. But it turns out we don't need a storm to flood this area. So it's been flooded 6 times in the 4 years we've been working there. And it gets flooded, the whole site gets flooded at once. This is the first flood we were able to observe in October 2019 of Tropical Storm Melissa, and it really wasn't a storm. It was a storm way offshore in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, but this flood effect came on shore here. So a very minor event resulted in a big change in the groundwater salinity. And what you can see in this data is this is the low forest, mid forest, and high forest. So first of all, the salinity, the floodwaters come up and infiltrates and raises the salinity of the whole site. And then it takes months for the groundwater salinity to recover to the baseline salinity levels. And so you can see the differences between the levels in our salinity data, but also that it takes much longer for the salinity to recover in the low forest than in the high forest. So that's the type of stress that we have in terms of salinity. It's like a pulsed stress that lasts for months, and that time varies between levels. And this is what the Canopy Dieback looks like. So we're taking leaf area data and canopy cover data. In the healthy forest, it's a pretty closed canopy. In the stressed forest, there's a lot of gaps. And then in the ghost forest, there's almost no canopy cover at all. And so this is the first, we just completed kind of the first year of our leaf area index data. So I'm very proud of this graph, because our field site is 5 hours away. We have to go every month to take these measurements. So it's a big investment. And I think the data looks really nice to see the seasonal signal in leaf area and how it varies between these forest levels, so that we can start to ask questions about phenology and about resource availability. We see big changes in the species composition across this site, and so that represents that filtering, environmental filtering effect of salinity. So here the live trees in the high, mid, and low forest. The composition is reflected in the colors within those bars, and the height of the bar represents the number of trees per hectare. And so you can see that the green color is the dominant tree. This is the loblolly pine, Pinus tata. So these are pine forests, but they have some mixed hardwoods in the healthy forest, and those hardwoods are filtered out first. So the pines are more tolerant, and then you have this orange species becomes more common in the low zone, and this is Juniperus virginiana. This is red cedar tree, so it's extremely salt tolerant genus, and it's kind of taking advantage of the climate niche there. And additionally, as you'd expect, the ghost forest has much more numerous dead trees, but we can this is kind of just summary data. We can see how the dead trees break down by species, and it's largely the dominant, and the species that recruits in is dying at the same time there. So we can see changes in the dead tree component, and and we're tracking these changes over time, I think this is going to be a really powerful census data set to be able to see mortality in real time. So we have, in the first 2 years, we had 12 trees die in the first year, and 25 trees die in the second year. And these represent 6% of the total census population. So it's a pretty high rate of mortality, as you'd expect in a dying forest. We can see what species are dying where, and we're also going to look at the post-mortem of these trees, how long it takes for a trunk to go from standing to falling, to understand the rate of change in the ghost forest. That's the hope. A really interesting change in the vegetation structure has been we've seen increases in shrubs that are very, very dramatic in the understory. And it's primarily one species, Morella cerifera. It's the common name is wax myrtle, and it's a nitrogen-fixing shrub. And we've seen changes in the canopy area, the height of shrubs, the diameter, the density of individuals, and the basal area. And so basal area in the high forest has doubled in just 3 years of data. So a really rapid change. It feels like the shrubs are marching through the forest like an army, very fast. And we've been looking also at this invasive species, Phragmites australis, that represents a major loss of habitat quality for the marshes where it's colonized. So we're very interested to know where it's colonizing. In a lot of marsh areas, Phragmites is the only species there. Once it takes over, it becomes monodominant, and it's low quality for a lot of the specialized marsh birds that are the source of a lot of the environmental protection in this habitat. So we found, first of all, that Phragmites establishes in the understory of the forest that's dying back before most other marsh grass species. And so it starts out as these very small clones, but it's there first and is able to preempt other species. That has important management implications because we can tell people, you've got to look in the forest to catch it while it's colonizing, and it's very easy to control. And then you can potentially eradicate it before the forest dies back and have a native marsh community that moves in. But we've been mapping changes in Phragmites across the site, and what you can see here in these maps is red represents an increase in the Phragmites density, blue represents a decrease, and gray is no change. And so we see much more increase in the low forest zone than the rest of the site. So this species is coming in on the trailing edge of the change. Whereas the shrubs increase the most in the high and mid zone. And so this is the low forest has almost no change in shrub density, and the mid and high have seen a lot more. And so this is happening more at the leading edge of the change. So we tried to compare to see if the shrubs were responding to Phragmites in any way. Are they competing against each other? Is there priority effects or something like that? So we did a contingency analysis looking at each point and whether it was more likely for shrubs to increase when Phragmites decreases or stays the same or increases. And what we found, the most common thing was no change. So where there was no change in Phragmites, there was also no change in shrubs, and there was really no other significant correlation between their changes through time, indicating it's unlikely that they're really affecting one another. These are changes probably in response to the abiotic, directly responding to the abiotic changes in the system. We've also done that analysis, and it's not so tight that you can just measure light, and where light increases, shrubs increase. So there's probably some other features about the system that we need to understand. The understory community is also changing somewhat, and so this is an ordination plot that just distills the community variation in all the species composition down to 2 dimensions. And so each one of these gray points represents a monitored plot in one sample period. And we've been doing this through several years. The years here I've represented as different shapes. So 2019 is a circle, 2020 is a triangle, and 2021 is a square. And so you can visualize change through time as moving from these centroid points through time. And so the low forest community has been shifting. All the communities have been shifting slightly. The low forest has shifted the most. But what I expected to see is that if there was kind of a natural progression where the low forest community was marching into the forest, then we'd expect to see these points moving towards one another, that the high forest was becoming more like the mid and the mid more like the low. So we'd see directional change in this direction. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing an orthogonal directional change, which indicates that the whole site is changing in the same direction, not towards each other. So this is kind of an interesting, intriguing result that I'm interested to see, where it goes in the future. So just to sum up all of this observational data for you, we've seen some very predictable patterns in the transition of ghost forest change, including the environmental filtering of sensitive tree species, the expansion of Phragmites, which we expected, but we've also seen some unpredictable changes. So no one told us there'd be this explosion of shrubs at the leading edge. So that was a big surprise to us and represents a change in the structure of the community. And we also haven't experienced very predictable changes in the understory community. So we're going to keep building this long-term data set, and then we're also going to do experimental tree girdling. And the last study that I'm doing here is a decomposition study to understand more about that nitrogen-fixing shrub and how it might be changing the soil environment. Okay, so the last research that I want to present to you is about how sea level rise kills trees. So we've been studying tree physiology using these sap flow sensors. So these can measure tree water use. They are the design of the sensor is three probes that stick into the xylem of the tree, and they have a central heating probe and then two probes with thermistors. And so it's called a heat pulse velocimetry approach. So the heating probe emits a heat pulse that can be detected by the thermistors on either the downstream or upstream probe. And so we can detect water flow this way in the tree in either direction, towards the leaves or towards the roots. And that's really important, and you'll see why. A lot of people use a design that has only two probes, where you actually can't detect bidirectional flow. So we installed these only in the loblolly pines, the dominant tree, and we installed them in 10 trees at this transitioning forest site. So 2 of these were in the high forest, 4 in the mid, and 4 in the low zone. And they're color-coded to match this graph that's showing sap flux density, which just means it's normalized by the cross-sectional area of the tree to compare trees of different sizes. And what we can see is that in the high plot and one of the mid plots, sap flux, or water used by trees, was much higher than in this other mid plot and the low zone plots. And so the trees in the high zone are photosynthesizing much more, using much more water. And over time, we expect that lower rates of photosynthesis in these large trees will exhaust the energy reserves of the tree, and that can result in tree mortality. So this is kind of matches a lot of the tree mortality studies that have been done in other systems. And something that I think is really interesting is water is so important in this system, and trees use a lot of water. And so I'm interested in the feedbacks that this reduced sap flow might have. So we'd expect that as individual trees declines across the gradient, that we'd see a positive feedback to waterlogging here in the low zone because the trees are sucking up less of that water, and a negative feedback to salinity because salinity is also tied to water volume. If there's more water in the ground, there's lower salinity concentrations. And we had I guess not surprisingly, given we had so many floods, we were able to look at a specific flood event and what that did to tree water use. And it was really pretty interesting. We're working with some hydrologists who are collecting the hydrological data here. So this is what the flood looked like in the soil and groundwater. So the groundwater level spikes and then kind of drops down a little bit but stays saturated. During the flood, the groundwater salinity spikes and then does that slow drop that, we don't see the end of it here. This is 2 weeks later, it's still dropping. And you can see, again, this is a different flood than the one I showed you before, but the salinity gradient is maintained across the recovery period. And this is what the tree sap flow did during that flood. So this is 2 weeks before the flood and 1 week after the flood, with the flood represented at this gray line. And then the different colors refer to the different levels of the plots, with high here, mid, and low. So you can see that reduced sap flow throughout the record in the low zone. And you can see also these, each one of these peaks is a daily signal responding to the daily cycle of photosynthesis. And each line is a tree. But what you can also see is during the flood, there was this big dip in the sap flow record across all plots. All trees did this, that there was sap flow in the reverse direction. We're really surprised to see that and interested in that phenomenon. So I'm going to show you on the next panel just this 2-day period around the flood so you can zoom in and see what happened. So now the top panel is the sap flow during that 2-day period for 2 of our trees. So you can see more distinctly that sudden reverse in sap flow direction and how punctuated it was as well. We observed that only at night when the trees are not photosynthesizing, and it happened to be during a very humid and rainy period as well, when vapor pressure deficit, which is the demand for water at the leaf surface, was 0. So that is when you expect you might be able to see reverse sap flow because the osmotic gradient is at its lowest. But I thought this was really interesting, and I'm going to follow up on this result because reverse sap flow can be a source of cavitation and embolism in tree vasculature. And this can ultimately reduce the hydraulic connectivity of the tree vasculature and reduce its ability to photosynthesize in the future. So this might also be a way that the trees lose the ability to draw up water and ultimately die. Now, I just had some really interesting conversations with an eco-hydrologist who was pointing out that it could have an alternate interpretation too, that the trees during this time of high humidity and the extreme kind of reversal in the water potential gradient because of the salty water surrounding their roots, that they might actually be able to take up water through stomata through the air, and that they could actually be kind of drinking from the air during a wet rainy event. So it's a really opposite interpretation, and I think the way I could follow up on this now is to look at the water potentials throughout the season and before and after a storm. So I'm really interested to keep looking at how these trees are responding. And I also just wanted to note, because here we are in a sometimes arid system, and in arid systems, during drought, a lot of people compare salinity stress to drought stress. And during drought, then trees can sometimes move water through the soil column from areas of plenty to areas where water is scarce. And that's not what's happening here, because here the whole system is water saturated. So I'm going to keep working on this topic, and we have some ideas with a graduate student in my lab to do maybe some pot experiments or field experiments where we actually add salt water to trees. And we're also going to look at this during the girdling experiment as the trees are really depleted in carbon, and we can see how they respond when their energy reserves are zero. And we're going to also look at other species because I want to know what happens in those hardwoods that are filtered out of the system, and I want to integrate with some of the hydrologists that we're working with to look at some of the feedbacks between the soil and the trees. So just to kind of conclude generally about the project that I've told you about today, first of all, we saw that sea level rise is reshaping coastal landscapes, and it's definitely happening at a continental scale and at a local scale, and likely at a global scale, and maybe you can tell me more. That in the mid-Atlantic, we see changes occurring on ecological timescales in meters per year. These ghost forests are a highly visible sign of climate changes, and they've given me a platform for engagement with the public and with stakeholders and with policymakers. And the ecological studies of the marsh forest transition has told us more about these ecological changes. It's pointed out possible feedbacks as well as physiological surprises such as reverse sap flow. And I thank a lot of collaborators I've had in my own lab on that side, and some collaborators at other institutions on this side, and my funding sources, mostly from NSF and USDA down here, and I want to thank you for listening so attentively.
Bueno, gracias por la presentación, muy linda. Quería saber si ustedes, o no me queda claro si ustedes tienen registrado otro evento de esta magnitud en el pasado. Porque entiendo que hace 8 años que están viendo esto, pero antes de eso.
Yeah, the floods that, it's okay if I answer in English. The floods that we've observed, so now we're able to study these events more carefully, but the flooding is not particularly new. These are floods that happen maybe once a year, and they've happened in the past too. But I mean, even now, like the flooding events, maybe they're happening more rapidly. Like in our first year of study, we detected 1. And then in the second year of study, we detected 4. And then in the third year of study, we've already had 2. So maybe they're happening more frequently, but probably there's just a little bit of variation through the period that we've been examining. But it seems like there's a lot of events where we can look at each event and what happened and try to understand more generally. Okay, for example, for the sap flow data, I'm really excited to take a look at some other sites and events and see, do we get this reverse sap flow? When do we get it? And do we get it across all trees or only a few? Things like that. But there hasn't been, I think also maybe you're asking about like the magnitude of the event. There hasn't been a big storm in this area since Hurricane Sandy, which was 2013.
Bueno, gracias también. Soy Marina. Bueno, nos encontramos.
Sí.
No, había leí que Phragmites tiene asociación con hongos endófitos que favorecen su tolerancia a la salinidad, y también después marcaste un arbusto que fijaba medio loco. Entonces me preguntaba si esta capacidad invasora o estos cambios podrían haber un feedback positivo con estos hongos endófitos o bacterias en el suelo, y si eso se está teniendo en cuenta para la restauración o para controlar esas especies.
I don't think that people are using that to control the invasive species because it has this positive effect, but I think there's got to be some really interesting changes in the microbial community because, you know, we go from a pine forest, so it's low pH, it's really like, it's kind of a mono, like a very homogeneous type of soil structure with a lot of pine inputs. And then to nitrogen-fixing shrub, like you said, Phragmites has the mycorrhizal relationships and the dark septate endophytes. And both of these are, make very also homogeneous stands, kind of clonal reproduction. So there's big changes happening, but I don't know the role. So we've started to now, like with this decomposition study, we ran CN analysis on different litter at different stages and some of the soils, and we're trying to work out some of the relationships, but I don't have the expertise in the microbes, but at least from the ecosystem perspective, start to get at this. And the litter types have vastly different carbon and nitrogen signatures. So, yeah, I could tell you more about it later.
No, pero esos monocultivos, incluso el pino con estos micorrizas, esas monoculturas que se han con un feedback positivo, cultivando su propio microbiota, ¿no?
Yes. Yeah, the decomposition study that we did was designed as like a home and away study so that we can see whether it's a specific community that's able to decompose its own litter. So that design may start to reveal something about that. The communities.
Supongo que estará empezando a ser colonizado por halófitas, esos maltas que tenéis, esas plazas que tenéis, o no viste muchas halófitas.
No entendí.
Halophytes.
Oh, halophytes. Sí. So the marsh grasses are halophytes, and they are very tolerant of much higher salinities than we get in this zone. So one of the kind of interesting things is, so Phragmites is not technically a halophyte, and it does better at the leading edge. Like we've transplanted that species around. It grows much better despite the low light availability in the freshwater environment. And so that's why it's able to recruit in the forest. Some of the other species don't do well with low light and can tolerate the salt. And that's why they get restricted more to the trailing edge of the ecosystem. So, yeah, we also see like another study, my graduate student was interested in this halophytic grass, the high marsh dominant Spartina patens. Spartina, yeah, and it's a very tolerant halophyte. And found, it's able to move into these transitioning areas, but it's unable to flower, completely unable to flower, because there's not enough light resources and it has high light demand. So, yeah, we're seeing it's not just differences in the species composition, but also their abilities and behavior. So for example, the Spartina then has to expand clonally only. It can't rely on seed.
En un momento hablaste de manglares.
Manglares, sí.
¿Tenés manglares ahí? No.
No, solo en Florida.
Hacia el norte.
Sí.
Amy?
Yeah, Amy.
So, how important do you think it is that the water is salty? Because there are other situations where you get these floodings of forests. I mean, some of the stuff that they've done with ecosystem retrogression, what they call that, where the soils become waterlogged with fresh water. And there's a similar sort of, at least a trajectory that you are describing for the coast forests on that coastal plain. So how much do you think it has to do with the flooding, and how much do you think it has to do with the fact that the water is salty?
So I think that it has to do a lot with the water is salty. Like initially when we got into this, some of the farmers we work with say it's all flooding. Oh, it's flooding. We're like, well, it's not really flooding because your soils are salty all the time. Even when the floods recede, the groundwater is salty, and that is the problem. It's actually not the water level, because most of the species here can tolerate high water levels. In fact, these forests are almost seasonally flooded. There's high standing fresh water during the spring, and then it dissipates during the growing season. But the loblolly pines are fairly tolerant to flooding, and all the changes we're seeing are much more consistent with salinity, changes due to salinity, like that filtering effect. The nitrogen-fixing shrub that we see expanding is moderately salt-tolerant, and it's also expanding on the barrier islands. So I have a colleague who's been studying that species in a totally different context, environmental context, but it's also expanding there. So yeah, I think that the changes are all related to salinity.
And possibly salinity effects on the microbial community in the soil.
There could be all kinds of indirect effects that matter.
As opposed to just straight flooding effects.
I think that also really important is the salinity effects on the trees and the canopy dieback and the light availability that we get. Is like how I think the changes move through the system. Well, thank you all for your.
¿Cuáles son las medidas o las prácticas de los farmers con estos battleground, cornfield? ¿Qué pueden hacer o por qué surgió esta charla con ellos para que puedan enmendar las cosas?
Yeah, they do a soil addition of gypsum, and that, yeah, a colleague is testing that a little more to see how it supposedly moderates the salinity. But there's not very much they can do. We also have found that sorghum is more tolerant of higher salinities, and there are farmers who have switched to sorghum, and they get a few more years out of their farming sorghum. So we've been looking at these alternative crop rotations and alternative species for the farmers to use. The alternative rotation that we built, based on known salinity tolerances of the crops, performed very badly. I think it's because, unlike all the natural species which tolerate a bit of flooding, the crops don't. And so, yeah, they have like these two problems, and we don't have species that really deal well with the two problems. So we have found we can grow switchgrass, which is a biofuel crop, on these lands very well, and it's a native species, so it's pretty good. So we've been telling them maybe try switchgrass, and then we're also exploring restoration species. So can we grow some other warm season perennial grasses that will provide habitat structure, provide food for wildlife, and they may or may not have uses for the farmers. Like there's a very large chicken industry in this region, and so a lot of the crops are to feed chickens, and we're thinking some of these crops might be good bedding for the chickens as well. So those are the kinds of things we're looking into. Yeah.
You can grow
Quinoa. Actually, they always say that. They say, I've heard quinoa.
but you know it's not very good with water excesses. So we need to cover that.
There
No
you go.
flood tolerance. Only the dry season. Más preguntas. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Gracias.
Que hubo un seminario que trabaja con marismas